Music swelled through the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, a suffocating waltz of diamonds, silk, and deceit. Genevieve stood frozen by the towering gilded pillars, her fingers white-knuckling a cheap flute of champagne, praying to become invisible against the damask wallpaper. "No one wants you here," Isabella hissed, leaning in close so the socialites nearby wouldn't catch her venom. Her breath smelled of vintage gin and pure malice. "Look around, Genevieve. You are a stain on the Sinclair name. A pathetic charity case in a hand-me-down dress." Genevieve lowered her gaze, swallowing the familiar, jagged pill of humiliation. But before Isabella could land another verbal blow, the string quartet faltered. The room went dead, terrifyingly silent. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed across the marble foyer. Matteo Vieri, the phantom king of the city's underworld, had arrived, and he was walking straight toward her. The Autumn Equinox Gala was the crown jewel of New York's high society, an annual gathering where the city's elite pretended to care about philanthropy while ruthlessly climbing the social ladder. Tonight, the Pierre Hotel was transformed into an opulent forest of imported white orchids and cascading crystal lights. For the Sinclair family, it was a crucial night. Their patriarch, Edward Sinclair, was desperate to secure investors for his failing real estate empire, hiding his impending bankruptcy behind a veneer of bespoke tuxedos and forced smiles. For Genevieve Sinclair, however, the gala was nothing short of a public execution. Genevieve was the illegitimate daughter, the dirty little secret Edward had been forced to acknowledge when her mother, a hotel maid with whom he'd had a brief, careless affair, passed away from ovarian cancer 10 years ago. Brought into the sprawling Sinclair estate in the Hamptons at the age of 14, Genevieve had been treated as an unpaid servant, a ghost haunting the hallways of a family that despised her existence. Tonight, she wore a dress that belonged to her half-sister, Isabella, from 3 seasons ago. It was a muted charcoal gown that had been haphazardly taken in at the waist. Next to Isabella, who was resplendent in a custom emerald green Vera Wang that clung to her curves like liquid glass, Genevieve looked exactly as she felt, like an afterthought. "Keep your head down and don't speak unless spoken to," Edward had warned her in the limousine ride over, his eyes lingering with disdain on her unadorned neck. "I only brought you because the board members value family unity. Do not ruin this for me, Genevieve." Now, standing on the periphery of the ballroom, she watched the glittering crowd. Politicians rubbed elbows with Wall Street titans, exchanging whispers that could crash markets or launch wars. It was a world entirely divorced from the reality she knew, the reality of hiding in the estate's library, studying late into the night, desperate to earn a degree that could finally fund her escape. Isabella approached her like a predator, cornering wounded prey. She was flanked by her 2 sycophantic friends, girls with sharp collarbones and sharper tongues. "I can't believe Father actually let you out of the house," Isabella sneered, her eyes raking over Genevieve's dress with theatrical disgust. "That color washes you out. But then again, it's fitting. You blend right into the shadows." "I'm just doing what Edward asked," Genevieve replied quietly, keeping her voice even. She had long ago learned that fighting back only fueled Isabella's cruelty. "Oh, please, don't call him that. It's embarrassing enough that we share a last name," Isabella snapped, stepping closer. The glittering chandelier light caught the heavy diamond pendant resting against Isabella's collarbone. "You think because you're standing in this ballroom, you're one of us? You're a stray dog he took pity on. No one wants you here, Genevieve. Look around. You are a stain on the Sinclair name, a pathetic charity case." Genevieve bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. The cruelty wasn't new, but the public setting made the words cut deeper, slicing through the armor she had spent a decade building. She wanted to drop her glass and run. She wanted to disappear into the humid New York night and never look back. But then, the atmosphere in the room abruptly shifted. It didn't happen with a shout or a grand announcement. It happened with a sudden, suffocating drop in temperature. The low hum of 100 overlapping conversations died out like a snuffed candle. The string quartet, mid-measure of a Vivaldi concerto, scraped to an awkward, discordant halt. Genevieve blinked, tearing her eyes away from Isabella's sneering face to look toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. A man had stepped over the threshold. He was flanked by 4 men in impeccably tailored, dark suits who moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit. But no one was looking at the guards. Every eye in the room was locked onto the man in the center. Matteo Vieri. Even Genevieve, isolated as she was, knew the name. Vieri Holdings was ostensibly an international logistics and shipping conglomerate. In reality, it was the sanitized corporate face of the Comora's Western operations. Matteo had inherited the empire at 25 after a car bomb claimed his father and 2 older brothers in Naples. Over the past decade, he had transformed a bloody, street-level syndicate into a sophisticated corporate hydra, dealing in everything from high-end real estate in Hudson Yards to deep-water ports on the eastern seaboard. He was a phantom, rarely seen in public, dodging federal indictments with the ease of a man who owned the judges signing the warrants. He was breathtakingly lethal. He stood over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling out a bespoke, midnight blue Brioni tuxedo. His hair was dark, swept back with a careless elegance, but it was his eyes that commanded the room. They were a piercing, glacial grey, scanning the ballroom with the detached boredom of an apex predator assessing a cage full of field mice. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. The mayor, standing near the champagne fountain, visibly paled. Edward Sinclair, across the room, looked as though he might hyperventilate, his hands trembling as he straightened his bow tie, undoubtedly mentally reviewing his company's ledgers. Isabella's sneer instantly vanished, replaced by a hungry, calculating gleam. "My God," she whispered, her hands drifting to her hair to smooth it. "That's Matteo Vieri. Why is he here? He never attends these things." Genevieve watched, mesmerized as Matteo began to walk. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, billionaires and socialites scrambling to get out of his path. He didn't acknowledge the governor, who offered a tentative nod. He ignored the hedge fund managers and the media moguls. His glacial eyes were locked entirely, unwaveringly, on Genevieve. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Genevieve's chest. "Look away," her survival instinct screamed. "Don't meet his eyes." But she was paralyzed. The sheer gravity of the man pulled the air from her lungs. Isabella, completely misreading the trajectory of Matteo's gaze, stepped forward, plastering on a dazzling, seductive smile. She thrust her chest out, preparing to introduce herself to the most powerful, dangerous man in New York. "Mr. Vieri," Isabella purred as he closed the distance. "It is an absolute honor to—" Matteo didn't even blink. He didn't break his stride. He simply brushed past Isabella as if she were a piece of misplaced furniture, leaving her standing with her mouth open, the Emerald Vera Wang suddenly looking very foolish. He stopped mere inches from Genevieve. Up close, he smelled of bergamot, expensive leather, and a faint, chilling trace of petrichor, like a storm that was about to break. A tiny silver scar marred the left side of his jawline, a brutal reminder that his power was not inherited safely behind a desk, but won in blood. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Genevieve could hear the ticking of the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. "Genevieve Sinclair," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, laced with a faint, sandpaper edge of an Italian accent. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of ownership. "Yes," she managed to whisper, her throat agonizingly dry. Matteo extended a large, calloused hand toward her. "The music seems to have stopped, but I find myself in the mood to dance. May I?" A collective gasp echoed through the room. Behind Matteo, Genevieve could see her father, Edward, his face drained of all blood, looking as if he were witnessing a ghost. Isabella was staring in mute horror, her face flushed with a furious mottled red. Genevieve looked at Matteo's outstretched hand. To accept was madness. To touch a man who could order a city block leveled with a single phone call was a death sentence. Yet, looking into his grey eyes, she saw something completely unexpected. Not cruelty. Not the mocking pity she received from her family. She saw a challenge. With trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, firm, and surprisingly gentle. Matteo didn't turn his head, but he snapped his fingers once. Immediately, as if jolted by an electric current, the conductor of the string quartet frantically tapped his baton, and the musicians launched into a tremulous, hurried waltz. Matteo pulled her onto the empty center of the marble floor. The crowd pressed back, giving them a wide, terrified berth. He placed his right hand on the small of her back, his touch burning through the cheap fabric of her dress, and smoothly guided her into the steps of the waltz. "You're shaking," he noted, his voice low, vibrating in his chest. "Most people do when you walk into a room, Mr. Vieri," Genevieve replied, surprised by her own sudden boldness. "I imagine you're used to it." A ghost of a smirk played on his lips. "I am. But I prefer my dance partners to breathe. You're holding your breath, Genevieve." She exhaled slowly, trying to match his fluid, commanding movements. "Why are you doing this? I am nobody. My sister was standing right there. She is the Sinclair you want to be seen with." Matteo's eyes darkened, a flash of pure contempt crossing his features. "Your sister is a parasite wearing imported silk. I have zero interest in Isabella, or the pathetic, scrambling rats that make up the rest of this room. I came here tonight for one specific reason. Which is? You." He spun her, the movement so seamless she felt as though she were floating, before pulling her flush against his chest. The proximity was intoxicating and terrifying. "Me?" Genevieve choked out. "I don't have any money. I don't have any influence. I'm the family secret." "You are the family scapegoat," Matteo corrected, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I know everything about you, Genevieve. I know about the unheated room they keep you in. I know about the accounting degree you've been secretly completing online at night. I know you paid for it by quietly selling off your dead mother's minor jewelry, piece by piece, to a pawn shop in Queens." Genevieve tripped over her own feet. Matteo's strong arm instantly caught her, holding her steady. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "How could you possibly know that? Have you been having me followed?" "It is my business to know the hidden ledgers of the men I deal with," Matteo said smoothly. "Your father, Edward, has been very foolish. He thought he could outsmart me." The puzzle pieces began to snap together in Genevieve's mind, forming a terrifying picture. The hushed phone calls late at night, the sudden sell-off of the Sinclair assets, the desperate need for investors tonight. "What did he do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward Sinclair was contracted to manage a series of real estate acquisitions for Vieri Holdings through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, Matteo explained calmly, as if they were discussing the weather rather than financial treason. Over the past 18 months, He has embezzled $25 million from my accounts, attempting to plug the massive holes in his own failing investments. He tried to hide it in a maze of offshore wire transfers. It was a valiant, albeit stupid, effort. Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face, stealing from the Camorra, stealing from Matteo Vieri. Her father was a dead man. The entire Sinclair family was marked. And me? Genevieve whispered, looking up into his glacial eyes. Why come to me? If you're going to kill him, why the public display? Because, Matteo said, stopping the dance. The music immediately ceased again. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. I don't just want my money back. I want his empire dismantled, piece by piece. I need an insider who understands his books, someone who has nothing but contempt for the Sinclair name. And more importantly, I believe in collecting debts in the most painful way possible. He stepped back, keeping her hand locked in his, and turned to face the terrified crowd. Edward Sinclair finally found his courage, or rather his desperation overpowered his survival instinct. He practically sprinted across the ballroom floor, his face gleaming with cold sweat. He skidded to a halt a few feet from Matteo, flanked by Isabella, who still looked bewildered and enraged. "Mr. Vieri!" Edward gasped, attempting a jovial, welcoming smile that looked more like a grimace of agony. What a profound honor. We didn't know you were attending. If you had called ahead, we would have arranged the head table for you. And I see you've met my daughter, Genevieve. Matteo looked at Edward the way one might look at a cockroach that had scurried across a dining table. Save the pleasantries, Edward. Matteo's voice was completely devoid of the warmth he had shown Genevieve a moment prior. It was cold, flat, and absolute. I am not here for the champagne, and I am certainly not here to socialize with a thief. The word hung in the air, heavy and damning. Whispers immediately broke out among the socialites. Edward's forced smile collapsed. "Mr. Vieri, please, there must be a misunderstanding," Edward stammered, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "The market fluctuations, the temporary liquidity issues. I can assure you every cent is accounted for. If we could just step into a private office." "There is no misunderstanding," Matteo cut him off. "The Cayman ledgers were delivered to my desk at 6 o'clock this morning. 25 million, Edward. You gambled with my money, and you lost. The penalty for stealing from my family is not negotiated in a hotel office." Isabella, sensing the destruction of her privileged life, stepped forward. "You can't do this. Do you know who we are? We are the Sinclairs. You're just a thug in a suit. My father will call the police." Matteo's bodyguards instantly tensed, their hands hovering over their jackets, but Matteo raised a single finger, stopping them. He slowly turned his gaze to Isabella. "Call them," Matteo challenged softly. "Call Commissioner Davis. You'll find him on my payroll. Call the feds. They will be highly interested in the tax evasion and wire fraud your father committed. You think your name protects you, little girl? Your name is dust." Isabella shrank back, the fight completely bleeding out of her, as the brutal reality of their situation set in. Edward dropped to his knees right there on the polished marble floor of the Pierre Hotel, abandoning all dignity. "Please, Matteo, spare my life. Spare my family. I will give you anything. The Hamptons estate, the company shares, whatever you want. I'll sign it all over." Matteo's eyes shifted from the pathetic, kneeling patriarch to Genevieve, who was standing beside him, still holding his hand. "You don't have anything I want, Edward. Your companies are leveraged to the hilt, and your estates are mortgaged," Matteo stated. Then his grip on Genevieve's hand tightened slightly. "Except for one thing." Edward looked up, confusion mixing with his terror, tracking Matteo's gaze to Genevieve. "Genevieve, you want her? She is the only asset of value you possess," Matteo declared, his voice carrying across the silent room. "A sharp mind, untainted by your corruption. I am taking her with me tonight. She will audit your remaining assets, dismantle your holdings, and transfer everything to Vieri Holdings. She is the collateral for your debt." "No!" Isabella shrieked, not out of love for her sister, but out of the sheer indignity of Genevieve being valued above her. "You're taking her. She's nothing." "She is worth 10 of you," Matteo sneered. He looked down at Genevieve. "Are you coming, Genevieve? Or do you wish to stay here on a sinking ship with rats who despise you?" Genevieve looked at her father, groveling on the floor. She looked at Isabella, her face twisted in ugly, jealous rage. For 10 years she had taken their abuse, hoping that one day she might earn a scrap of familial affection. Tonight she realized it was a fool's errand. They were poison. Matteo Vieri was a monster, a criminal, a man forged in violence. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a captor. She saw a locked door swinging wide open. "I'm coming," Genevieve said, her voice steady and clear. Matteo nodded once. "Good." Without another word to Edward, Matteo turned and walked toward the exit, pulling Genevieve alongside him. The guards formed a protective wedge around them. No one tried to stop them. The elite crowd practically plastered themselves against the walls to avoid touching Matteo's shadow. They stepped out of the stifling heat of the ballroom and into the cool, rain-slicked New York night. A massive, black Mercedes Maybach S680 was idling at the curb, its engine a low, powerful purr. A driver in a sharp suit immediately opened the rear door. Matteo gestured for her to get in. Genevieve slid onto the plush leather seats, the scent of luxury overwhelming her senses. Matteo slid in beside her, filling the spacious cabin with his imposing presence. The heavy armored door thudded shut, sealing them inside a soundproof vault, instantly silencing the chaos of the city outside. "Drive," Matteo ordered. The Maybach glided smoothly away from the curb, leaving the Pierre Hotel and the ruins of the Sinclair family behind. For a long time, the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the wet asphalt. Genevieve stared out the tinted window, watching the neon blur of Times Square pass by. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She had just traded a domestic prison for a gilded cage owned by the mob. "You're awfully quiet for a woman who just escaped a lifetime of servitude," Matteo finally spoke, breaking the silence. He poured a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter built into the center console. Genevieve turned to look at him. In the dim light of the street lamps filtering through the glass, the harsh angles of his face were softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "I'm just trying to understand the reality of my situation, Mr. Vieri," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. The chill of the rain was setting into her bones. "You didn't take me just to spite my father. You could have hired any forensic accountant in the world to dismantle his companies. Why me?" Matteo took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze running over her with an analytical, calculating intensity that made her skin prickle. "Because, Genevieve, a hired accountant doesn't have the motivation of vengeance," he said softly. "A hired accountant can be bribed. But a woman who has been treated like a stray dog for 10 years, who has been starved of affection and humiliated in public, that woman will burn her father's empire to the ground with a smile on her face." He leaned closer, the scent of bergamot wrapping around her. "I don't just want my 25 million back. I want Edward Sinclair to know that the daughter he threw away was the instrument of his absolute destruction. And I need someone on the inside who can navigate the digital footprint of his offshore accounts, something my usual enforcers lack the finesse to handle. "So I am an employee?" Genevieve asked, her voice betraying a hint of skepticism. "Or a prisoner?" Matteo reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing the cold, bare skin of her shoulder. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "You are under my protection," he murmured, his voice dropping to an intimate register that felt more dangerous than any threat. "As long as you are useful to me, no one in this city will ever look down on you again. But make no mistake, Genevieve. If you try to run, or if you try to protect that pathetic excuse for a father, you will find that the monster they whisper about is very, very real." Genevieve swallowed hard, staring into the abyss of his grey eyes. She was in a world of predators now, but for the first time in her life, she had a set of teeth of her own. "I don't care about Edward," she whispered. "Give me the ledgers, Mr. Vieri. Let's burn it down." A slow, genuine smile spread across Matteo's face, predatory and breathtaking. "I think, Genevieve," he said, clinking his glass against the console, "this is the beginning of a very profitable partnership." The Maybach bypassed the bustling avenues of Midtown and glided down toward Tribeca, eventually descending into a heavily fortified underground garage beneath 56 Leonard Street, the iconic, glass-stacked high-rise known to New Yorkers as the Jenga Building. Genevieve knew of the building. A single penthouse here commanded upwards of $40 million. When the private elevator doors parted on the 60th floor, Genevieve stepped into a fortress of glass, steel, and shadow. The penthouse offered a dizzying, 360-degree panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. The city lights glittered like scattered diamonds on black velvet. But inside, the aesthetic was minimalist, cold, and undeniably masculine. Dark walnut floors, brutalist concrete pillars, and a massive custom-built Eames lounge chair positioned in the corner dictated the tone. Matteo shrugged off his suit jacket, tossing it over a leather sofa. The holster strapped to his chest, housing a matte black Sig Sauer P226, was a jarring contrast to the bespoke tailoring of his tuxedo shirt. He didn't try to hide it. "Vincent!" Matteo called out. From the shadows of the adjacent hallway emerged a broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped beard and eyes as dead as shattered glass. Vincent wore a sharp grey suit, but the slight bulge near his waistline betrayed his profession. "Sir," Vincent said, his voice a low rumble. He barely glanced at Genevieve, treating her with the detached indifference one might give a new piece of office equipment. "Show Miss Sinclair to the East Wing. The study has been retrofitted," Matteo instructed, unbuttoning his cuffs. He turned to Genevieve, his grey eyes catching the city lights. "You will find a dual-screen setup, a secure Linux partition, and encrypted access to the offshore data dumps we extracted from your father's servers. You have 48 hours to trace the exact routing of the 25 million. And if I need more time?" Genevieve asked, standing her ground despite the overwhelming intimidation of the room. Matteo poured a glass of San Pellegrino at the marble kitchen island. "You don't have more time. The SEC is already sniffing around Edward's domestic accounts. If the feds freeze his assets before I drain them, this entire exercise is pointless, and you lose your value to me." He didn't need to elaborate on what happened to things that lost their value to Matteo Vieri. Vincent led her down a long corridor, lined with abstract, monochromatic art. The room she was given was vast. A king-sized bed with fret linens dominated one side, but her attention immediately snapped to the sprawling oak desk near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The workstation was a financial auditor's dream. 3 curved monitors, a Bloomberg terminal keyboard, and a stack of physical, leather-bound ledgers recovered from Edward's private safe. For the next 24 hours, Genevieve barely slept. Vincent silently brought her meals: black coffee, a rare steak, a plate of fresh burrata, and heirloom tomatoes. But she ate mechanically, her eyes glued to the cascading lines of data on the screens. The deeper she dug into Edward Sinclair's financial labyrinth, the sicker she felt. Her father was not just a terrible businessman, he was a coward of the highest order. At 2 a.m. on the second night, Genevieve found the smoking gun. She was tracing a series of fragmented wire transfers through a web of shell corporations registered in Belize and the British Virgin Islands. The money had been painstakingly laundered, split into microtransactions, and bounced through dormant accounts at UBS and Credit Suisse to mask its origin. But Genevieve had a gift for pattern recognition. She noticed a recurring alphanumeric sequence in the metadata of the routing numbers. She ran a decryption script Matteo's tech team had provided. When the veil dropped, the ultimate holding company holding the $25 million was revealed: G-Sync Holdings Limited. Genevieve stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice. G-Sync. She furiously pulled up the incorporation documents. There, digitized but unmistakably clear, was her own signature. Edward had forged her signature. He had named her as the sole beneficial owner of the shell company that held the stolen Camorra money. If the FBI had raided the Sinclair estate, Edward would have feigned ignorance, and Genevieve would have been indicted for wire fraud and money laundering. If Matteo's men had simply followed the paper trail without bringing her in, they would have assumed she was the mastermind and put a bullet in her head. Her father had set her up as the sacrificial lamb. A sudden, sharp knock broke her concentration. Matteo walked in. He had traded his formal wear for a simple black Henley that clung to the hard lines of his chest and shoulders, and dark trousers. He carried 2 steaming espresso cups. "You're breathing heavily," Matteo observed, setting the cups down on the oak desk. He leaned over her shoulder, his proximity sending a sudden, confusing jolt of warmth through her exhausted body. He smelled of soap and gunpowder. "What did you find?" Genevieve pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "Look at the beneficial owner." Matteo leaned closer, his eyes narrowing, as he read the document. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and dangerous. When he finally spoke, his voice was a lethal whisper. "He framed you." "He didn't just frame me," Genevieve said, a bitter, broken laugh escaping her lips. Tears of absolute rage pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "He signed my death warrant. He knew you would come looking for the money. He made sure my name was on the door when you arrived." Matteo straightened up. The cold detachment that usually masked his features fractured, replaced by a dark, terrifying fury. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently gripping her shoulder. The touch was anchoring, surprisingly tender for a man who orchestrated violence for a living. "Edward Sinclair is a dead man," Matteo said softly. "But he will not die quickly. I promise you that." Genevieve looked up at him. The fear she had felt at the Pierre Hotel was gone, entirely replaced by a burning desire for retribution. "Don't kill him yet," she whispered, her eyes locking with his. "Let me finish dismantling his life first. I want him to watch it all burn, knowing I struck the match." Matteo's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. The look he gave her was no longer one of a captor assessing collateral. It was the look of a man recognizing an equal. "Burn it down, Genevieve," he murmured. "I will provide the gasoline." By the morning of the 3rd day, the atmosphere in the penthouse was suffocatingly tense. A storm had rolled in off the Atlantic, battering the glass walls of the Jenga building with relentless, driving rain. The gloom outside perfectly matched the dark reality Genevieve was uncovering on the Bloomberg terminal. Something wasn't right. She had successfully accessed the Cayman accounts. She had isolated the $25 million that Edward had siphoned from Vieri Holdings. But as she prepared to execute the digital transfer, to route the funds back into Matteo's clean corporate accounts, she noticed the transaction history. The money hadn't been sitting idle. Edward hadn't stolen it to cover his real estate debts, as Matteo had assumed. The debts on the Sinclair properties were still glaringly active, the mortgages unpaid. If he didn't pay off his creditors, Genevieve muttered to herself, rapidly clicking through the bank statements. Where did the money go? She traced the outbound flow from G-Sync Holdings. 3 days ago, a massive lump sum wire of $20 million had been pushed out of the Cayman account. The destination wasn't a hedge fund or a real estate escrow. It was a numbered account in a private bank in Cyprus, an institution notorious for ignoring international sanctions. Genevieve cross-referenced the routing data with a dark web registry Matteo had given her access to. When the match came back, her breath caught in her throat. The Cyprus account belonged to a front company operated by the Tarasov Syndicate, a brutal, highly militarized faction of the Russian Bratva that controlled the narcotics trade in Brighton Beach. The Tarasovs and the Vieri Camorra had been locked in a bloody, subterranean Cold War for the better part of 5 years. Edward Sinclair hadn't just embezzled money, he had funded Matteo's greatest enemies. Panic surged through her veins. Why would a cowardly real estate mogul give $20 million to the Russian mob? The answer hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was a bounty. Edward knew he couldn't hide from Matteo forever. So, he used Matteo's own money to hire the Tarasovs to eliminate him. Genevieve shoved her chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. She sprinted out of the study, her bare feet slapping against the cold walnut floor. "Matteo!" she screamed, bursting into the main living area. Matteo was standing by the kitchen island, going over architectural blueprints with Vincent. Both men snapped their heads toward her, instantly alert. Matteo's hand instinctively dropped to his waist, resting on the grip of his sidearm. "Genevieve, what is it?" Matteo demanded, stepping toward her. "The money," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. Edward didn't lose it in the market. He didn't use it to save his company. He transferred $20 million to a Cyprus account 3 days ago. Vincent swore violently in Italian. Matteo's face turned to carved granite. "Who?" Matteo asked, his voice deadly calm. "The Tarasov Syndicate," Genevieve said, her voice shaking. "Matteo, he didn't steal to pay debts. He paid for a hit. He paid them to kill you." The realization settled over the room like a shroud. Vincent immediately reached for the radio clipped to his belt to alert the perimeter guards. "Lock down the building," Matteo ordered, his eyes never leaving Genevieve. "Get the cars ready in the subterranean level. We need to move her to the safe house in—" Before Matteo could finish his sentence, the world exploded. A deafening, concussive roar ripped through the penthouse. The reinforced, bullet-resistant glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall spider-webbed, then completely shattered inward in a shower of deadly, jagged diamonds. The Tarasovs hadn't waited. They had brought the war to the 60th floor. "Get down!" Matteo roared. He lunged across the open space, tackling Genevieve to the floor, just as a hail of high-caliber automatic gunfire shredded the space where she had been standing seconds before. The beautiful, minimalist living room was instantly transformed into a war zone. Expensive artwork was shredded. The marble island erupted in clouds of white dust as bullets pounded into it. Matteo shielded her body with his own, his heavy, muscular frame pressing her into the hardwood floor. The scent of cordite and pulverized concrete filled her lungs, choking her. "Vincent! Suppressing fire!" Matteo yelled over the deafening roar of the assault. Vincent, bleeding from a superficial cut on his cheek, had already drawn a compact submachine gun from beneath his jacket. He popped up from behind a shattered concrete pillar, unleashing a disciplined, controlled burst of fire toward the shattered windows. They were taking fire from a neighboring high-rise under construction. Snipers. "Are you hit?" Matteo demanded, his face inches from Genevieve's. His eyes, usually so cold and detached, were wild with an adrenaline-fueled intensity. "No," she choked out, her ears ringing violently. "I'm okay." "Stay exactly here. Do not move a muscle," he commanded. He drew his Sig Sauer, his jaw clenched tight. Matteo rolled away from her, using the ruined kitchen island for cover. The deafening exchange of gunfire echoed off the high ceilings. Genevieve curled into a tight ball, squeezing her eyes shut, terrified that every second would be her last. This was the reality of Matteo's world. Behind the tailored suits and the Maybachs was a river of blood and relentless violence. After what felt like an eternity, the incoming fire abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of rain whipping through the shattered windows and the crunch of Vincent's shoes on broken glass. "Clear," Vincent called out, his voice breathless. "We clipped the shooter on the adjacent roof. He's down, but they'll have teams moving up the stairwells. The building security is compromised." Matteo holstered his weapon and immediately crossed the room, dropping to his knees beside Genevieve. He grabbed her arms, pulling her up. "We are leaving." "Now," he said. Genevieve looked at the destruction around them, her whole body shaking violently. The reality of how close she had just come to dying crashed over her. She looked at Matteo, seeing the dusting of concrete on his dark hair and the fierce, protective grip he had on her arms. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind blowing through the broken windows. "You warned me," Matteo corrected, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intense murmur. "If you hadn't found that wire transfer, I would have been standing by that window when the first shot broke the glass. You saved me, Genevieve." He reached up, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. His thumb lingered on her cheek, rough and warm. The air between them, thick with smoke and danger, suddenly crackled with a different kind of electricity. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that the dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just the collateral. She was the woman who had kept the Phantom King alive. "Come on," Matteo said, his eyes darkening as he pulled her firmly against his side. "We have a war to win, and your father has a debt to pay." The escape from the Jenga building was a masterpiece of orchestrated chaos. Matteo did not rely on the compromised elevators. Instead, he forced Genevieve down a reinforced maintenance stairwell, his body perpetually angled to shield hers. Vincent covered their rear, laying down a suppressing field of fire that echoed like rolling thunder down the concrete shaft. They emerged into the subterranean garage just as a pair of black, armored Cadillac Escalades screeched to a halt. Matteo shoved Genevieve into the back of the lead vehicle, diving in immediately behind her. "Chelsea Piers now," Matteo commanded the driver. The Escalade tore out of the garage, violently smashing through the descending security gate and merging into the torrential Manhattan rain. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked at Matteo. His tuxedo shirt was ruined, smeared with concrete dust, and a streak of blood that wasn't his own. Yet, he looked entirely in his element. A king of the underworld who thrived in the darkest, most violent currents of the city. "They missed," Genevieve whispered, the shock finally beginning to set in. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. Matteo reached across the wide leather seat and took both of her hands in his. His grip was rough but incredibly grounding. "They missed because of you. If you hadn't traced that cypress wire, we would be dead on that floor." He leaned closer, his glacial grey eyes locking onto hers in the dim, strobing streetlights. "You have crossed a line tonight, Genevieve. You are no longer just an accountant. To the Tarasovs, you are a Vieri." "I don't even know how to hold a gun," she replied, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You don't need a gun," Matteo said softly, his thumb tracing the knuckles of her trembling hand. "You have a mind that can level entire syndicates without firing a single shot. That is far more dangerous." They arrived at Chelsea Piers just as the storm intensified. Waiting at the end of a private dock was a twin-engine Sikorsky S-76 helicopter, its rotors already slicing through the heavy rain. They boarded swiftly, lifting off into the turbulent night sky. 30 minutes later, the helicopter descended onto a sprawling, heavily fortified estate hidden deep within the forested hills of Greenwich, Connecticut. It was a fortress masquerading as a Gilded Age mansion, entirely off the grid and guarded by heavily armed men patrolling the perimeter with Malinois tactical dogs. Once inside the cavernous, mahogany-paneled library of the safe house, Matteo immediately went to work. He established a secure command center with Vincent and his lieutenants, barking orders in rapid-fire Italian, coordinating a brutal, city-wide counter-strike against the Tarasov holdings in Brighton Beach and Sheepshead Bay. Genevieve, refusing to be sidelined, demanded a laptop. "Set me up with an encrypted VPN routing through a Swiss proxy," she told Matteo's lead tech specialist, a quiet man named Elias. If my father used G-Sync Holdings to pay the Tarasovs, he didn't do it in a vacuum. There has to be a collateral agreement. For the next 48 hours, the Greenwich estate became a war room, while Matteo orchestrated physical destruction, burning down Tarasov smuggling warehouses and severing their supply lines at the port of Newark. Genevieve waged a silent, devastating war on the digital front. She dug deeper into the metadata of the Cyprus transfer. What she found made her blood run cold. "Matteo!" she called out late on the second night. The Grand Library was quiet, illuminated only by the glow of her monitors and the embers dying in the massive stone fireplace. Matteo walked over. He looked exhausted, the silver scar on his jaw pronounced in the low light. He had traded his ruined formal wear for dark jeans and a black tactical sweater. He stood behind her chair, his hands resting on the backrest, his presence wrapping around her like a heavy protective blanket. "Show me," he said. "Edward didn't just pay them 20 million for a hit," Genevieve explained, pointing to a labyrinth of Swift network logs on the screen. "He offered them the Cayman Shell Company as collateral. If the Tarasovs successfully eliminated you, Edward promised them the remaining 5 million in the account, plus the holding company itself. But here is the twist. G-Sync Holdings is legally tied to my name. If the federal authorities trace the assassination funding, they won't find Edward. They will find me." Matteo's grip on the back of her chair tightened until the leather creaked. "He weaponized your identity. He sold me to the Russian mob and the FBI in one stroke," she whispered, the profound betrayal finally stripping away the last remnants of her filial loyalty. "He wanted me to take the fall for your murder." Matteo gently turned her chair around, so she was forced to look up at him. The sheer, predatory fury in his eyes was terrifying, but none of it was directed at her. "I told you I would give you the gasoline to burn his empire," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a rough, intimate register. "What do you want to do?" Genevieve looked at the man who was supposed to be a monster. In the span of 3 days, he had shown her more respect, more protection, and more genuine partnership than her own flesh and blood had in a decade. "I want to freeze it all," Genevieve stated, her voice hardening into steel. "I have the administrative keys to G-Sync. I can initiate a catastrophic fund recall, claiming the Cyprus transfer was fraudulent. It will trigger an automatic freeze by the international banking authorities. The Tarasovs won't be able to access the 20 million. And then she paused, a dark, brilliant plan forming in her mind. And then I am going to empty every single domestic Sinclair account, the corporate reserves, the personal trusts, Isabella's trust fund. I will route it through a dozen shell companies and dump it entirely into an irrevocable charitable foundation for disadvantaged women in Brooklyn. By the time the sun comes up, Edward Sinclair won't have the money to buy a cup of coffee. A slow, devastatingly handsome smile spread across Matteo's face. He leaned down, his face mere inches from hers. The air between them crackled, heavy with adrenaline and undeniable attraction. "You are a terrifying woman, Genevieve Sinclair," he murmured. "Are you afraid of me?" she challenged softly. "I am utterly captivated by you," he replied. He closed the distance, his lips meeting hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a collision. It tasted of danger, of late-night espresso, and of absolute, raw power. Genevieve kissed him back with a fierce, desperate hunger, anchoring her hands in his dark hair. In his arms, the ghost of the Pierre Hotel ballroom died completely. She was no longer a victim. She was a queen claiming her king. By 4 a.m., the financial devastation was complete. Genevieve hit the final execution command on the Bloomberg terminal. In less than an hour, billions of dollars vanished from the Sinclair ledgers, legally and irrevocably locked into philanthropic trusts that Edward could never touch. Simultaneously, the Tarasov front accounts in Cyprus were frozen solid by Interpol fraud alerts. Genevieve had effectively financially castrated both her father and the Russian syndicate. "It's done," Genevieve said, leaning back in her chair. Matteo's phone buzzed. He answered it, listening for a moment before hanging up. Vincent tracked them. Edward and Isabella just arrived at Teterboro Airport. He chartered a private Gulfstream G650. He's trying to flee to Dubai, somewhere beyond our reach and beyond extradition. He doesn't know the accounts are empty yet, Genevieve realized. He thinks he still has his empire. "Let's go break the bad news," Matteo said, racking the slide of his Sig Sauer. The drive to Teterboro in New Jersey took less than 40 minutes in the dead of night. Matteo's convoy of Escalades breached the perimeter of the private aviation terminal with terrifying ease, his heavily armed men securing the tarmac before the airport security even realized what was happening. The sleek white Gulfstream was idling on the runway, its jet engines emitting a high-pitched whine. As Matteo's vehicles surrounded the plane, bathing it in blinding LED headlights, the aircraft's door opened. Edward Sinclair appeared at the top of the airstairs, clutching a leather briefcase, looking pale and frantic. Isabella was right behind him, bundled in a chinchilla coat, clutching a Birkin bag to her chest like a shield. When Edward saw Matteo step out of the lead vehicle, his knees buckled. He practically collapsed down the stairs, falling onto the wet tarmac. Isabella shrieked, freezing on the steps. Matteo walked slowly toward the plane, the wind from the jet engines whipping his dark coat around him. Genevieve walked perfectly in step beside him. She wore a sleek black trench coat Matteo had given her, her posture straight, her chin held high. "Going somewhere, Edward?" Matteo asked, his voice cutting through the roar of the engines. Edward scrambled backward on the pavement like a crab, his eyes wide with horror as he looked between the Mafia boss and the daughter he had thrown away. "Matteo, please, I was going to secure foreign investments, to pay you back." "You paid the Tarasovs," Matteo stated flatly. "You tried to put a bullet in my head, and you tried to frame your own daughter for the privilege." Isabella, sensing the end, rushed down the stairs, desperate to save herself. "Mr. Vieri, it was all him. I didn't know anything about the Russians. Take him. Just let me go. I have my own money, my own trust fund. I'll give it to you." Genevieve stepped forward. The frightened, silent girl who had stood by the gilded pillars of the Pierre Hotel was completely gone. "You don't have a trust fund, Isabella," Genevieve said, her voice ringing out cold and clear over the tarmac. Isabella whipped her head toward her sister, her face twisting in confusion and disgust. "What are you talking about, you little rat? Of course I do." "Check your phone," Genevieve suggested mildly. Isabella frantically dug her diamond-encrusted iPhone out of her pocket, her manicured fingers shaking as she opened her banking app. The screen illuminated her horrified face. "Balance, $0. "What did you do?" Isabella screamed, dropping her designer bag. "Where is my money?" "I took it," Genevieve said, stepping closer to her father, who was still cowering on the ground. "All of it. The corporate accounts, the offshore shells, the Hamptons estate equity. It's all gone, Edward. I transferred every single cent into a blind philanthropic trust. You don't have the money to pay the pilot of this jet. You don't have the money to pay off the Tarasovs, who are going to be very, very angry when they realize you bounced a $20 million check for a hit." Edward stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. You ruined me. I am your father. My mother was a maid who worked herself to death while you ignored us," Genevieve said, her voice laced with absolute venom. "You brought me into your house to be a servant. You humiliated me, and then you forged my signature to frame me for murder. You ruined yourself, Edward. I just balanced the ledger." Matteo placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Genevieve's lower back. He looked down at Edward with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "The feds are on their way, Edward," Matteo said softly. Genevieve was kind enough to anonymously forward the SEC your unredacted ledgers. You are looking at 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. But that's only if the Tarasovs don't find you first. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Red and blue lights began to strobe against the chain-link fences of the airport perimeter. "Leave them," Genevieve said, turning away from the pathetic ruins of her family. "They have nothing left. They are exactly what Isabella always called me. Nobodies." Matteo nodded. He signaled his men. They piled back into the Escalades, just as the first wave of FBI tactical vehicles burst through the terminal gates, swarming the idling Gulf Stream. As the Escalade pulled away, Genevieve looked out the tinted window one last time. She saw Edward being slammed against the tarmac in handcuffs, while Isabella stood screaming in the rain, completely ignored, her chinchilla coat soaked and ruined. Genevieve rolled up the partition, shutting out the sirens, the rain, and the past. She leaned back against the plush leather seat, exhaustion finally washing over her. Matteo pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on the top of her head. "It's over," he murmured, his thumb gently stroking her arm. "You're free." Genevieve closed her eyes, listening to the steady, powerful beating of his heart beneath his tactical sweater. "No," she corrected softly, tilting her head up to meet his fierce grey eyes. "We're just getting started." The high society gossips of New York never fully understood what happened the night the Sinclair empire evaporated into thin air. Edward was sentenced to 2 decades in a maximum security federal facility, and Isabella faded into the bleak obscurity of a cramped Queen's apartment, entirely forgotten by the elite circles she once desperately clung to. Genevieve Sinclair, however, became a phantom legend. She didn't just survive the underworld, she conquered it. Standing beside Matteo Vieri, she transformed his brutal syndicate into an untouchable, impenetrable global empire. She became his sharpest weapon, his trusted confidant, and his undisputed queen. The girl who had once hidden in the shadows of ballrooms now commanded the absolute, terrifying loyalty of the city's most dangerous men, proving that the most lethal force in the world isn't a bullet. It's a woman who has finally learned her own worth.